Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoterica, continuing Ridge Racer retrospective, where I take a look at all of the mainline Ridge Racer games. And if you can't tell already, we're taking a detour into Nintendo land today because we are looking at Ridge Racer 64. This was not actually developed by Namco, it was made by an in-house team at Nintendo because they were getting a little PlayStation envy and wanted a Ridge Racer game of their own. And this is comprised of some courses you've seen, some courses you haven't, and while it definitely looks like Ridge Racer and plays in part like Ridge Racer, it is a very different experience and I've never been very too fond of the game. Before I get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, I have a Patreon link down below as well. But it makes total sense that Nintendo wanted a Ridge Racer game because these were some of the most popular launch games for PlayStation hardware. There were so many awesome Ridge Racer games on the PlayStation 1, but Nintendo was left out in the cold, and outside of Mario Kart and Wave Race, they really didn't have a traditional arcade racing game. And because Ridge Racer was all the rage, very much intended for Ridge Racer, Nintendo decided to get the license and remake it entirely on their hardware. And that is where the first issue in my mind lies. This is a remake, it's a reimagining, and it completely changes up some of the physics and drifting mechanics, and even the collisions, so it looks and plays like Ridge Racer. It just doesn't feel like Ridge Racer. That bump right there basically killed all of my momentum. And if you watch some of the other cars as they drift, they kind of just skip around and feel like they almost teleport into their actual drift in some spots. I'm not saying this is a bad game, it's not at all. It is just such an odd feeling game that I've never been able to really think of it as a Ridge Racer game. It kind of feels like a Kirkland brand Ridge Racer for lack of a better term. It has all of the same appearance, all of the same flavor, but you know something's definitely off and it's not what you were expecting. If we move over to the PlayStation 1 version of the game, watch the screen cadence here and the frame rate. When we go over to PlayStation 1, it's just a much smoother experience. Nintendo 64 always had more perspective correct textures and polygons, but it would sacrifice that sometimes at the sensation of speed. When you play Ridge Racer on PlayStation 1, you know you're playing a port of the arcade original that looks, plays, and feels just like that System 22 version. But when you go over to the Nintendo 64, it just doesn't have that same feel. If you had never played a PlayStation 1 Ridge Racer or an arcade Ridge Racer, that might make sense, but if you played a bunch, especially for retrospective, you will see the difference. And there, I couldn't even get my drift started, and that car just skipped out into its drift like it basically teleported at a 45-degree angle. And that really is the thing here. Drifting feels different, and when you initiate a drift, you're never quite sure what's going to happen. Sometimes you feel like you do the same thing twice and get completely different results. I tried to drift in one corner and just hit the wall, tried to drift into the next corner and went around the course perfectly. And that is not what you want out of a racing game. You want to feel like if you make a mistake, the mistake is yours and not that the game's programming was fighting you. But let's move over into a track that you haven't seen yet, something in Ridge Racer 64. And I will say the new content here does not live up course-wise to what Namco is providing in the arcades and on PlayStation 1. It's a fun attempt, but it feels very Nintendo here. And again, anytime you bump any of the cars or the guardrail, the physics in this game just seem to do some very strange things. I'm not sure if they completely rewrote the physics and handling engine for the Nintendo 64, or they did a code port trying to get it working as good as they can on Nintendo 64 hardware, but it's always had that very bizarro world feel to it, like it's the same exact thing except somehow different. I will say graphically it is impressive, it looks nice here on the Nintendo 64, but looks are only half of the challenge when it comes to an arcade racing game, and as far as the control and feel of Ridge Racer 64, I've just never been able to understand it. Leave me a comment down below and tell me if I'm missing something or if you played the game what your impression is, but for me it's a fun curiosity, but a game that definitely has more flaws than it has upsides. It's not that it's not fun, it's just that it's not as fun as the PlayStation versions or the arcade originals, so for this generation of consoles, it definitely hits the bottom of the list. The best part is, though, it is still a Ridge Racer game and has amazing soundtrack, so go ahead and listen for 45 seconds and I'll be right back. Awesome soundtrack, but what else would you expect from a Ridge Racer game? Although I will say that the sound effects and the tire screeching engine noises do come across a little bit loud and can drown out the music in spots, and sometimes I bump the wall like right there. It doesn't even look like the car actually comes in contact with the guardrail. Some of the collision detection in this game could be definitely off, and it feels like you hit something when you actually didn't, or maybe it's just a camera perspective trick, but there's definitely a few instances in which I end up getting bumped and I don't even really see what I hit, and that's definitely not something you want in an arcade racing game. And that's the weird thing about this title. It makes perfect sense on paper, but in the feel, it just never clicks. I am playing Ridge Racer 64 Drift Mode. You have more than one, but I'm going with what the game offered as a default and what it was doing here, including the collision mode. But honestly, when I play around with those, it doesn't really seem to change. Where if we move over to a PlayStation 1 entry, the speed is up, the drifting is consistent, the bumps and physics make total sense. And that's what really is the thing about Ridge Racer 64. The feel is off. Even when you go into the cockpit mode, it doesn't really feel like you're going 100 miles an hour, and it just seems to be that the Nintendo 64 hardware can't keep up frame rate wise to deliver that smooth arcade racing experience. Even though this is a fun level, I love the southwestern vibe, there's some good turns in it, it just doesn't feel like Namco was involved, and that's because they weren't involved, and Nintendo didn't put their lead development team on this either. It was a development house they didn't really use all that often to port this game over, so it kind of just feels like a port that was there to try to satisfy fans so they could play Ridge Racer on Nintendo 64 and not have to go to PlayStation, but not a port and new game thought out enough to really stand toe-to-toe with the PlayStation 1 releases, and definitely not the arcade releases. And that's the disappointing part. Ridge Racer on Nintendo 64 should have been so much better than it was. You have technically superior hardware, and you have a team at Nintendo bringing the game over, but somewhere down the line it just feels like it went slightly wrong. This again isn't a bad game, there's definitely much worse racing games on Nintendo 64, but as far as all of the Ridge Racer games on PlayStation 1, I would put this at the bottom of each and every one of them. It's got all the look and feel of Ridge Racer, but it just doesn't do it right. But again, if you disagree, leave me a comment down below. And I know I'm only showcasing a few courses in this game, and that is because honestly I've never had the desire to get deeper into the game. That is the #1 fundamental flaw in this version compared to everything else. It just never excites me enough to want to sit down and actually play it for any length of time. I just end up getting bored with it and then go and play something else, and that is not what you want out of a Ridge Racer game, and I can't really say that about any other Ridge Racer title I've ever played. I played them from start to finish, I unlock all the tracks and all the courses, and I have a fun time. Sure, some games are better than others, but there's never been a Ridge Racer game in the mainline franchise that's made me just turn it off and say, you know what, I really don't want to spend the time doing it. But that's exactly what Ridge Racer 64 does. It bores me. It doesn't excite me like a Ridge Racer game should. It doesn't give me that same sensation of handling and speed, and sometimes it even jumps you into objects because you can't see them until you come at them blindly. It just is a very weirdly laid out game, and that's just disappointing because you can't really say that about any other Ridge Racer franchise, and you get much later into the mix with games like the Vita version kind of feeling like a shell of its former self. But this was at the height of Ridge Racer's popularity. It was at the height of games coming out on PlayStation 1 that were absolutely killing it, and Ridge Racer was still very popular in arcades. So while Nintendo wanted to have that same Ridge Racer fun on their console, it kind of feels like they phoned it in. It's a photocopy of a good game, and you lose some fine granular detail in that photocopy when you actually make it, and that is not what you want out of a Ridge Racer game. I don't know why Nintendo was so fixated of getting a port onto this system. They just should have spent the time and money making their own original arcade racing game to compete with something like Ridge Racer 64, because honestly you probably just would have gotten a better result out of it. Am I glad that Ridge Racer 64 exists? Of course I am. It is a fun game to look at, but as far as console Ridge Racer games that I would play, this one is at the bottom of the list. It just does all of the right things in the wrong way. It looks like Ridge Racer, it sounds like Ridge Racer, and in some instances it can feel like Ridge Racer, but it is just off. It is one of those things, they never should have tried to port the game in the first place. They just should have had Namco do it themselves. I'm sure Nintendo was trying to save some money by having an in-house team do it, and the end result is Ridge Racer 64. A disappointing effort that has some shades of the original game, but not enough to actually make it a must-play whatsoever in the franchise. But if you agree, definitely leave that comment down below and let me know. Short of that, we're done. I'm going to go play a different Ridge Racer game, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.